from the College by the Lake, Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. Local, regional, national, and international guests discussing the issues and topics affecting the way you live are on Forum, the North Idaho College Public Forum, with your host and moderator, political scientist Tony Stewart.
Our topic for today's discussion is the American Red Cross. There are very few organizations that have been around as long in a voluntary capacity that has served so many people as the American Red Cross, and certainly our viewers are very familiar with the work the American Red Cross has done in such times as World War I and World War II, in fact, historically going back to the Civil War. Today we'd like to do two things on this program. First of all, we'd like to talk about the history of that organization from that historical perspective and what has happened for a very long time. And then number two, we'll talk briefly about the future and what might be some of the plans of the American Red Cross. We're very pleased to have two guests to discuss that today. They are from our local organization, but they are qualified certainly to discuss what we want to do both in history and the future. I first of all welcome to the program Pamela Krause, who is the manager of the Idaho Panhandle chapter of the American Red Cross. And Pamela, in our previous discussions, it's been most informative, and we thank you for taking time to be with us today.
It's a pleasure to be here today, Tony. Thank you.
And I'm equally happy to have here Wendy Meter, who is the Public Affairs Director of the Idaho Panhandle chapter of the American Red Cross, and she has recently returned from work with the American Red Cross in other parts of the country, such as California, and we're very, very pleased to have you, Wendy, with us today.
Very wonderful to be here today.
And I'm also very pleased to have our two regular panelists to question our guest today. First of all is Janelle Burke, who is an attorney in the state of Idaho, and next to her is Steve Schenck, who is the Dean of College Relations and Development at North Idaho College, and I shall ask Janelle to commence the questioning.
This has been such an interesting experience talking with you before the show about the American Red Cross. And Pam, let's start with you. I know that history is one of the things that makes up the aura of the Red Cross. What people always think about the Red Cross. What is some of the history, the historical events that have happened with the Red Cross?
Well, of course, the Red Cross was founded in the late 1800s when Clara Barton became aware of it internationally, and when she came over and the Civil War was going on, she saw a need for a response to the victims of the Civil War and out in the fields and providing medical services and just comforting and working with the servicemen in the hospitals and families and people who were affected by the Civil War. So it began early on and evolved from that point and continued on. And then in 1900, the work of Clara Barton and others was recognized, and so the American Red Cross was formed, and we were chartered by the United States government in 1900 to continue those services and enhance those programs.
And I think there have been times when there have been great outbreaks. For example, the influenza outbreak that you were speaking about before the program. Can you tell us a little bit about that, Wendy?
There's been several outbreaks of both influenza and other types of diseases that have spread throughout the United States. I think that some of the direction that the Red Cross has done in conjunction with some of these outbreaks also occurred during times of disaster. For instance, in 1906, not very long after they were chartered as an organization, they were there helping with the 1906 earthquake, great earthquake that we've all read about in our history books in San Francisco. And there were many outbreaks of disease and that type of thing going on with that. Prior to that, just before that, they also helped with the great Johnstown flood. And some of the great disasters that we read about in our history books, the Red Cross was there at those earliest times, providing aid and help to the disaster victims.
Also, Pam, now when there is a war, like World War I, World War II, does the American Red Cross help on both sides, and the Red Cross internationally, I suppose, would be the correct question. Do they help on both sides of the conflict, or are they on one side only?
Well, internationally, we are an organization that maintains neutrality, and so the services that we provide would be to the benefit of whomever needs them on that basis, a neutrality basis. And so if they are provided on both sides, it would be from the organization that is affiliated with that country, internationally or nationally. So our purpose is to maintain a neutrality format for all of our services, and we don't get involved in the conflict part of it at all.
Steve Sheen.
I wonder if one of you could tell us just a little bit. We've talked about charter. That word has come up already. Could you tell us what the charter, and I'm going to use that and mission almost interchangeably, of the organization is? What is it exactly that the Red Cross is designed to do?
Okay, we were chartered by the government in 1900 and then rechartered in 1905 to enhance our services. They recognized the fact that the American Red Cross was an organization that excelled, per se, in recruiting volunteers, in training the volunteers, and providing those services. They knew how to get the people out into the field where their needs where their services were needed to provide comfort or aid or to train other people, for instance, in health and safety, CPR, first aid, water safety. And so because we were recognized that, we were chartered, and that is our main focus in our programs, is to continue to provide those services, and that's disaster relief and emergency communication for the military.
Wendy, can you give us an idea just how big this organization is?
Well, we have 1.48 million volunteers throughout the United States, 14,000 trained and ready, disaster-trained volunteers that are ready to go out at a moment's notice on a national disaster. And basically, in terms of training alone, we come in contact with 11 million Americans a year. Come into contact and take one of our life-saving courses in the areas of CPR, first aid, HIV, AIDS, throughout all of the different life-saving services we offer. So that's a number of Americans that at some time in their lifetime come into, in a given year even, come into contact with the American Red Cross.
Pam, how is that whole enormous group of people organized? I was understanding before the show that this is a pretty highly structured and organized effort. How's it broken out?
Well, I'll start at the level of the chapter. There is a chapter representative in each county. There might not be an office, but they would be affiliated with a chapter located in a surrounding county. Beyond that, each state is connected to a region, and there are 10 regions within the United States. Then there's the national sector at the top level. But within each region, each state is comprised of a state consortium where all the chapters coordinate and work together. So we have now quite a networking process so that all services are provided at the same level of standards and quality to all people, regardless of where they live, because of course in some areas it's so rural and makes it difficult to get those services to people who are living in outside areas, surrounding areas. So it's our priority to make sure that the structure stays to uniform to encompass all people wherever they live.
And that structure, we do have people in Canada who watch this show on a regular basis. There's a Canadian Red Cross.
Right.
And the same structure would apply in Canada and the other countries that are served by Red Cross?
Actually, their structure is a little different because, of course, they are a different country, and
they're not exactly chartered the same way.
Right.
Each province is different in the services that they decide they want to provide in their province. Quebec is actually, I have been told by people that work very close with the Canadian Red Cross, is the province that most closely is the same as the American Red Cross. And it does differ. It's organized in more of a regional sense in terms of how it's organized. They do not have necessarily chapters in every small town like you would see, I think, it more widespread in small towns across America. And their fundraising is carried on in a little different way and that type of thing. But we have had some wonderful experiences with the Canadians. In the last 2 years, they have been able to come down and actually participate in many of our large disasters to give them experience in areas that they would normally not have experience in, such as hurricanes, for example. And we have a very good cross-training. There's an training institute coming up next week that I'll be attending in Whidbey Island.
Can I interrupt to say
Sure.
that this show won't air till May, and it was in March that you were talking.
Right, that's true. But they're actually having lots of opportunities to cross-train, and we attend their regional workshops and that type of thing. So there's lots of interchange going on back and forth, which is really a wonderful experience for both sides.
And besides the cross-training, we also invite them to participate in disasters, responding to disasters. And so, for instance, Wendy had the opportunity to work with some Canadians who came down and worked on the floods, and vice versa. We are also invited back. So there is a relationship there to help each other in our training and experiences.
I would say to our viewers that I had the opportunity to meet with Pam and Wendy, and I liked doing that prior to the show, and they were most helpful with a lot of information. And I know that nationally you have videos and you have a lot of training manuals and so forth. And so I have consented to ask our staff if they would run a 30-second video that tells us some really important things about the American Red Cross, and I'll ask the staff to do that at this time.
These days, the media seems to move faster than ever. No sooner does something happen than the TV cameras are there covering it. There before almost anyone else. Almost. Please support the American Red Cross. The need is real. The time is now. Help can't wait.
Well, you can see from that very brief video that it shows a lot of action, the kind of things you do, and then also there was an 800 number that can be called for more information about the American Red Cross. Wendy, maybe I shall ask you this question. One of the things that a lot of our viewers might be interested in, Steve and Janelle done an excellent job with history and the organizational structure and all, but the American Red Cross has changed over time with the service and needs, or it goes through. It's flexible. If we have war, how it does things, and in peacetime, other things. Would you just identify the major service areas of the American Red Cross, all the areas that you, as of this time, do cover?
Well, at this time, we cover our primary area of services that we're asked that we must provide is disaster services. Our second area is transmitting emergency services to the military. Then we also have biomedical services, or also referred to as blood services. And then we have our health and safety area also. Pam,
and also international tracing.
And international tracing, or international services, which is really a little bit separate. So those are our main areas of service.
Our main areas, and then they go a little bit beyond that on another level that we refer to as our should services, and those are the services that encompass more of the health and safety training, the CPR, first aid, water safety, and also all chapters respond locally to single family disasters such as house fires, and then also HIV/AIDS presentations and those kind of community-based services that are required. And then on the third level, there's another level where chapters can concentrate even more locally and localize programs that are obviously needed within their own communities, and so they target those needs.
Well, certainly you have really revealed how essential your services are, and just to give one as an example is the whole issue of blood and blood transfusions and how very vital it is to life, and that will always be ongoing and important. Before I go back to the panel, Wendy went to California, as I mentioned, some time ago. In fact, January 1995, with the floods were taking place there. And there's such a human quality to what you do, and there's a little painting going to come up on the screen in a moment from a child in California, in which this has got to be really sending the message of what you do, and it must be very, very revealing and happy for you. Wendy, would you tell us about this?
Yes. Well, this picture was actually drawn by a 6-year-old boy whose family had experienced many of the effects of the disastrous flooding that occurred. This area was around the Sacramento, California area. And he drew this on a brown paper sack and presented this to one of our family service caseworkers. And his mother, I talked to her later, and she said that he had done this without any prodding. He had done this as a response on his own, in a way of thanking, because he was so gratified and very thankful that the Red Cross was there. And I think that for all of us that saw this, and staffers and everyone actually that saw this, it just responded in an amazing way to this picture, because to us it really was what brought it all home as to why we're out there volunteering and why we're doing some of the work, and that's people helping people and really responding to people in times of need, and this kind of brought it all home, I think.
And he identifies all members of the family, and
that's right.
is thinking on behalf of all of them.
It's
I thought it was just such a cute story.
It's a wonderful picture, and we all it was very motivational for all of us to see that picture, and sometimes you get caught up on assignments and all of the things that are going on, and that kind of brought it all home.
Janelle Burke.
Pam, perhaps you could tell us a little bit about the Red Cross emblem. It is something that we all recognize, and we immediately understand what it means. But what is it really?
Actually, at the beginning, when the Red Cross was founded, because we're connected with the Geneva Conventions, and it is the opposite of the Swiss flag, is what it is, the colors. And it represents a symbol of neutrality, like we discussed earlier on. And because of that recognition, it has become a logo or a symbol that is protected by the Geneva Conventions and the international societies of the Red Cross. And so that is one of our obligations as a chapter, to protect that emblem wherever it is, and to use it within our standards and guidelines that they have set up for all chapters to adhere to.
Now I have another question, and this gets into the procedures that you use when you're notified that there is a disaster, or let's say that there's a disaster, and then what happens after that? I mean, how do you take steps, and are those steps the same pretty much anywhere that the Red Cross is going to be called in? What kinds of things? Let's start with Wendy and just say what the instructions might be. If there were a local disaster, what would you do?
Well, if it was it's a little different if it's more of a single family, but I assume you're talking about more of a multi-type, any type of a multi-situation. Basically, some of the first people that are on the scene that are connected with the Red Cross are our damage assessment personnel, who actually go out and are trained to go out and assess the actual level of the damages, whether it be a flood, fire, whatever is going on. They basically do some initial assessment that then it is transferred basically back to the local chapter, and the local chapter, based on some of those assessments, would begin to decide whether it's something that we could actually handle on the local level, or whether we would be wanting, and in most cases we probably, would that not be correct, Pam, would be contacting our lead disaster chapter in the state. Every state has a lead disaster chapter. We basically, early on in any kind of a situation, put them on alert that there is something going on. If it's determined that the scope of the damage of the disaster is beyond our capabilities to handle it on the local level with our number of volunteers, then we would begin to move up the ladder. And I think then Pam could also address, as we go up the ladder, how that occurs.
Right. As soon as the emergency operations centers are opened and the damage assessment figures begin to come in, and like Wendy said, that they determine the scope of the disaster and what they are able to handle, and the lead units are notified, well, they are kept apprised of those figures, and as the disaster momentum builds, then they put out a call nationally to all volunteers that are registered in a national system called the Disaster Services Human Resource System. And those are volunteers that have been recruited and trained locally and then they respond locally to gain experience, and then they get in the system, registered in the system, and then they're called up. And that can be on levels of damage assessment, of emergency family assistance, of mass care, the important one, and of course public affairs. And as those people are needed, the numbers, they just keep putting the call out to the local chapters through the state lead unit. And then for instance, if a chapter has 5 volunteers that can go, then the chapter prepares them and sends them to that location. They are usually asked for a minimum of a 3-week commitment. That is one of the areas that is most important, because it does take that long to arrive, be orientated to your duties, get involved in those duties and perform them, and then wind up your commitment before the next person comes in to relieve you. So there's a constant, if the disaster continues to go for a while, like the floods and the weather continues to increase those chances of additional damage, then more people are brought in to relieve the last shift of volunteers from all over.
The disasters usually are classified by level 1 to level 5, and based on the estimated dollar figures that the disaster is going to run. And so based on that, there are certain procedures that kick in at certain levels in terms of notifying national. And I should mention that the National Red Cross in Washington, D.C. operates what they call the DOC. We call it the DOC in Red Cross terms, which is the Disaster Operations Center that is open 7 days a week, 24 hours a day. It's staffed, and it's on call immediately to go out into the field. And they have people, disaster action team members that go out immediately, fly out to areas when anything occurs to help assess what the needs are going to be for volunteers to come in and for staff to come in. So it's a very excellent system. They've put a lot of time in the last few years particularly to really upgrade that system and be able to respond, and this is one of our key messages that we're trying to get out to the American public, and respond immediately to disasters when they occur.
Our goal is...
Obviously it's a huge effort, and I did want to follow up quickly on that question. You were a volunteer during the floods in California. Could you also have been sent, for instance, to the earthquake in Japan? Does it happen internationally as well?
It's not, it's a separate system actually that operates the international system. You register for that system a completely different way, and usually to go out, you're expected to go out for a minimum of 6 months at a time on an international assignment. The requirement currently for national duty is anywhere from 2 to 3 weeks. So it's really completely operated as a totally separate entity.
Well, that answer brings me back to another whole line of questioning that I wanted to pursue, and that's funding. It's a big, big effort. How do the resources come in that supports the American Red Cross, for instance, and is that similar to what's done in Canada and the other organizations under the International Red Cross banner?
Well, under the American Red Cross, the National American Red Cross, funding is always direct donation. At this point, though, we need to recognize the fact that we have been supported and funded by the United Way, and we definitely thank them for that support. But as we are going into the future, and there are so many devastating disasters, and the economy, the direction that it's going, that it is obvious that we need to change the direction of fundraising. So we do look at the donated dollar to support all of our disaster services and emergency communication. So when a disaster does occur, an immediate appeal is put out for support of that disaster. On the international level, as Wendy referred to earlier, their fundraising structure is a little bit different. But as you see on TV, where there are earthquakes in Japan, for instance, and the Rwanda relief and so forth, people can donate and have their dollars designated to those kind of international disasters also. We do have a system in place for that.
Wendy, I have some familiarity with the fundraising business, and I know there's an awful lot of competition out there for donated funds. I just wonder, from your perspective, the Red Cross is such a pervasive organization that sometimes those big, broad-based, multifaceted organizations almost become invisible. It occurred to me when you mentioned some of the health and safety training you do. The CPR class I took was delivered
Right.
by the American Red Cross. But I think if somebody had asked me that question
That's
before
right.
the show, I wouldn't have been able to answer that. Do you find that a problem, and what do you do to try to raise the visibility of the organization?
Well, interestingly enough, we're in the midst right now, and this earlier video that we showed is part of our national community campaign, and we're in the midst of it. It was kicked off on February 27th, and we're during the month that's going on right now, we're in the midst of it, and that is to raise the awareness of the American people. It's to get the message out. The American people have told us in an extensive marketing survey that we did that they would respond with dollars and volunteer time if we asked them, but we hadn't been really asking the American people to respond. And so we're at a point now where we're actually trying to train this into all facets of our services, which is getting our instructors to mention to people in classes, we'd love to, there's many volunteer opportunities available. Come, volunteer with the American Cross. There's lots of ways that we can actually, that we have not really been thinking about in the past as an organization. And because, as Pam mentioned, our funding sources are dwindling, disasters are up 13% in the last few years. So despite the fact that we really have had wonderful support from the United Way organization, the fact is that the needs are going up, and we're going to have to find a way to respond to those needs.
We only have 2 minutes left, and we did promise our viewers we'd talk a little bit about the future. I saw a
That's
video
right.
that you did with your leader, Elizabeth Dole, and she, on that tape, was talking some about the future. Your organization grows, and it develops, and it changes some. What are some of the future plans of the American Red Cross?
At this point in health and safety, in the area of health and safety, we are looking at programs to address the issue of the elderly and their needs and concerns. And so in that area, all chapters are assessing and doing needs assessments in their communities to see, if that's a direction that the Red Cross now needs to focus on, just as we did for HIV/AIDS, and are bringing that into the communities. We're now looking at the need for the elderly. We're also looking at the need to utilize the talents and resources of the younger adults, involving our youth community and satisfying their need to volunteer and want to volunteer.
You'll see us recruiting on
Yeah,
campus soon.
right.
This is a wonderful place to recruit. Now, they're actually very much targeting the 20s and 30s generation, and AmeriCorps, which is the volunteer akin to the Peace Corps program that President Clinton started, has already been working with our organization and training to provide services, and they have done a wonderful job, and we see lots of opportunities in the future for young people's organizations such as that to gain training and work within the volunteer force of the American Red Cross to provide services. So,
On that note, we have to bring the permanent conclusion. On behalf of the panel and the staff, we thank both of you for being here, and you were generous with your time, and you were very informative, and I know our viewers, like the panel and myself, learned a lot about the American Red Cross. Thank you very much.
thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, our guests have been Pamela Krause and Wendy Meter, talking about the American Red Cross from a historical perspective as well as the future. I would like to invite you to be with us again next week at this same time, when we will discuss yet another issue. Until then, please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
The North Idaho College Public Forum was videotaped live from the studios of Instructional Technology on the campus of North Idaho College for viewing at this more appropriate time. We invite you to join us again next week for another all-new edition of the North Idaho College Public Forum on this public television station.